December 17th, 1979. Chicago was in the grip of one of the coldest winters on record. The temperature had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, and a thin layer of fresh snow covered the streets, muffling the sounds of the city. It was just after 11 p.m. when Officer Nathan Riley received the call. A body had been discovered in an alleyway 3 blocks from Lake Michigan, near the corner of Monroe and Lakeshore Drive. The scene was eerily quiet when Riley arrived. The snow in the alley remained largely undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading toward the street, presumably belonging to the sanitation worker who had discovered the body while emptying dumpsters. The victim lay partially concealed behind a large industrial trash container, her body positioned in a way that suggested she hadn't been killed there, but placed with some deliberation. "We've got a female victim, late 20s to early 30s, Riley reported into his radio, requesting homicide detectives and the medical examiner. Within 30 minutes, detectives Ray Morrow and Blake Halsey arrived at the scene. Morrow was a 20-year veteran of Chicago PD's homicide division, known for his methodical approach and unflinching demeanor. Halsey, 15 years his junior, had earned a reputation as a meticulous note-taker, with an uncanny ability to spot inconsistencies that others missed. The victim was identified as Elaine Townsend, 28, through a library employee ID card found in her coat pocket. Elaine worked as a reference librarian at the Chicago Public Library's main branch, just under a mile from where her body was discovered. According to her supervisor, who was contacted immediately, Elaine had worked the late shift and would have left the library around 9 p.m. 2 hours, Halsey muttered, writing in his notepad. 2 hours between leaving work and being found. We need to account for every minute. The initial examination revealed that Elaine had died from strangulation, evidenced by the distinctive bruising around her neck. There were defensive wounds on her hands, broken fingernails, and bruising on her knuckles, indicating she had fought back against her attacker. The medical examiner noted that the murder likely occurred within an hour of her leaving work, based on body temperature and the onset of rigor mortis in the freezing conditions. "She didn't go down without a fight," Morrow observed, as he examined the area around the body with his flashlight. The beam caught something unusual, small droplets of blood on the snow that didn't appear to have come from the victim. The medical examiner confirmed Elaine had no open wounds that would explain the blood spatter. "Bag it," Morrow instructed. "Our perp might have left us a calling card." A thorough search of the alley yielded few additional clues. Some fibers caught on the rough brick wall, a partial footprint in a patch of mud that had been protected from the snow by an overhanging fire escape, and a button that didn't match anything the victim was wearing. Every item was meticulously catalogued and bagged as evidence. By morning, the detectives had pieced together a preliminary timeline. Elaine had left the library at 9:05 p.m., according to the security guard who remembered exchanging pleasantries with her as she exited. She typically took the bus home, but on that night, the route that would have taken her closest to her apartment was experiencing delays due to the weather. Security camera footage from a bank 2 blocks from the library captured Elaine walking past at 9:17 p.m., heading east, the opposite direction from her normal bus stop. She was changing her route, Halsey theorized, maybe trying to catch a different bus line because of the delays. The investigation turned to canvassing businesses along the route Elaine might have taken. A bartender at the Lakeside Tavern, located 3 blocks from where the body was found, recalled seeing a woman matching Elaine's description. She had stopped in briefly around 9:30 p.m., ordered a hot tea, and used the payphone. She appeared anxious, he noted, and kept looking out the window as if expecting someone or something. The detectives obtained the phone records for the tavern's payphone. Elaine had made a single call to her roommate, Alexandra Weber. When interviewed, Alexandra explained that Elaine had called to say she was taking a different route home due to bus delays and would be about 30 minutes late. Alexandra had offered to pick her up, but Elaine had declined, saying she had already arranged another way home. "Did she mention who was giving her a ride?" Morrow asked. "No," Alexandra replied. but she sounded relieved, like she was glad not to have to wait in the cold. I assumed it was someone from work. The library staff was interviewed extensively. None admitted to offering Elaine a ride that night, and all had alibis that were quickly verified. The investigation expanded to include regular library patrons who might have interacted with Elaine. One name stood out: Curtis Patterson, a graduate student who frequently visited the reference desk where Elaine worked. Several colleagues mentioned that he often stayed until closing time on days when Elaine was scheduled for the late shift. Patterson lived in the same neighborhood as Elaine, just 3 blocks from her apartment. When questioned, Patterson admitted to being at the library that evening, but denied offering Elaine a ride or seeing her after she left work. He claimed to have stayed until closing, then gone directly to a study group at Northwestern University's downtown campus. The study group confirmed his presence from 10 p.m. until midnight. His timeline works, Halsey noted reluctantly, but it's tight. He could have intercepted her after she left the tavern, done the deed, and still made it to his study group by 10. The blood samples collected from the scene were sent to the lab, but the technology of 1979 was limited. The best they could determine was that the blood was type O negative, not matching Elaine's type A positive. They also found microscopic skin cells under Elaine's fingernails, evidence of her struggle with the attacker, but DNA testing was still years away from being a viable forensic tool. Over the next few weeks, Morrow and Halsey pursued every lead. They interviewed dozens of people who lived and worked in the area. They investigated Elaine's personal life, looking for jilted lovers or personal conflicts, but found nothing suspicious. Elaine was well-liked, had no known enemies, and wasn't involved in any activities that might have put her at risk. Security camera footage from businesses along potential routes between the tavern and the alley where Elaine was found yielded nothing useful. Many establishments didn't have cameras, and those that did had systems that were rudimentary by today's standards, grainy, black-and-white images that revealed little. By February 1980, the investigation had stalled. The press, which had initially given the case significant coverage, dubbing it the librarian murder, had moved on to newer stories. The detectives continued to work the case, but with no new leads and mounting pressure to focus on fresh homicides, the Townsend case began to drift toward the back burner. Halsey, however, couldn't let it go. There was something about Elaine Townsend, perhaps the look of determination in her staff photo, or the meticulous organization of her apartment that mirrored his own methodical nature, that made her murder feel personal. He spent countless off-duty hours reviewing the case files, revisiting the crime scene, and interviewing witnesses again, hoping someone would remember a detail they had previously forgotten. In June 1980, a potentially significant lead emerged. A homeless man named Rufus Meeks, who frequented the area where Elaine was found, came forward claiming he had witnessed a man and woman arguing near the alley on the night of the murder. He hadn't come forward earlier because of outstanding warrants for petty theft, but guilt had eventually compelled him to speak up. Meeks described seeing a tall man with dark hair, wearing a security guard's uniform, walking alongside a woman, matching Elaine's description. They appeared to be arguing in hushed tones. The man had grabbed the woman's arm forcefully at one point, and she had pulled away. Meeks had moved on, not wanting to get involved, but was certain the encounter had occurred between 9:30 and 10 p.m. This new information sent the investigation in a different direction. The detectives began looking into security companies that operated in the area. 3 major firms provided guards to businesses within a 10-block radius of the crime scene. Employee records were subpoenaed, and dozens of security guards were interviewed. None perfectly matched the description provided by Meeks, whose credibility was questioned due to his admission that he had been drinking that night. Without more corroborating evidence, the lead gradually lost momentum. By December 1981, the 2nd anniversary of Elaine's murder, the case had gone cold. Halsey, now working with a new partner after Morrow's promotion to lieutenant, still kept a copy of the case file in his desk drawer. On the anniversary of the murder, he would pull it out and review it, adding notes about new forensic techniques that might be applied or leads that could be revisited. In 1982, the case was officially classified as inactive, a bureaucratic term that felt like an insult to Halsey. Elaine Townsend deserved justice, and he had failed to deliver it. The evidence, including the blood samples, fibers, and skin cells, was carefully preserved in the department's storage facility, awaiting advances in technology that might one day speak for a victim who could no longer speak for herself. What no one realized at the time was that the killer had left behind more than just blood and fibers. Hidden in those samples was a genetic fingerprint, a unique identifier that would remain dormant for decades until science caught up with what was needed to solve the case. The evidence waited patiently in a cardboard box labeled Townsend E. Unter case Oka 79-42261, while the person responsible for Elaine's death continued to live their life, perhaps believing they had gotten away with murder. But as the years would prove, some secrets refused to stay buried forever, and justice, though delayed, was merely waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. The years following Elaine Townsend's murder saw significant changes in the Chicago Police Department. By 1985, Detective Blake Halsey had been promoted to sergeant, overseeing a team of homicide investigators while still carrying the weight of his unsolved cases, particularly that of the young librarian whose killer had eluded justice. "Some cases get under your skin," Halsey explained to a rookie detective who questioned his continued interest in the Townsend file. "They become part of who you are as an investigator." Elaine Townsend didn't just die that night in 1979, she became immortal in these files. December 17th became an unofficial ritual for Halsey. Each year, on the anniversary of Elaine's death, he would retrieve the case file from storage, review the evidence, and add new notes reflecting advancements in forensic science or investigative techniques that might someday help solve the case. He maintained contact with Elaine's family, particularly her younger sister, Caroline, who had moved to Chicago after the murder to be closer to the investigation. "I don't have much to tell you this year," Halsey admitted to Caroline during their annual meeting in 1986, "but I want you to know we haven't forgotten her." Caroline, who had initially been full of anger and demands for answers, had over time developed a resigned appreciation for Halsey's dedication. "I know," she replied, sliding a photograph across the table. "Elaine at her college graduation, full of promise and ambition. Keep this. Maybe it will help you remember what's at stake." The photograph joined others pinned to Halsey's bulletin board, a gallery of the unavenged that served as both motivation and burden. In 1988, a series of strangulation murders in Chicago's North Side briefly reignited interest in the Townsend case. 3 women had been killed over a 6-month period, all found in alleyways, all strangled. The similarities to Elaine's murder were striking enough that Halsey pulled the old files and compared evidence. Despite the parallels, forensic analysis determined the new murders were the work of a different perpetrator, a conclusion confirmed when a suspect was arrested and confessed to the recent killings, but had a solid alibi for December 1979. The brief connection to a current investigation had brought the Townsend case back into the department's consciousness, however temporarily. Lieutenant Ray Morrow, Halsey's former partner who now headed the homicide division, authorized the re-examination of the physical evidence using newer techniques. "The blood samples are still viable," the lab technician reported, "but beyond confirming the blood type and some basic enzyme markers, there's not much more we can do with current technology." The field of DNA profiling was in its infancy at that time. The first use of DNA evidence in a criminal case had occurred in England just 2 years earlier, in 1986. The technique was still considered experimental and was not yet standard procedure in American law enforcement. The potential was clear, however, and Halsey made sure the Townsend evidence was properly preserved for future testing. By 1991, computerization of police records was transforming how departments managed cold cases. Paper files were being digitized, making it easier to cross-reference information and identify patterns across multiple investigations. Halsey embraced the new technology, becoming one of the first in his department to learn database management, specifically to enhance his cold casework. "You're wasting departmental resources," complained Captain Warren Phillips during a budget review. "The Townsend case is over a decade old. We have current homicides that need attention." "With respect, sir," Halsey countered, "every victim deserves justice, regardless of when they died. And every unsolved murder is a potential time bomb, either because the killer might strike again or because it undermines public trust in our ability to do our jobs." His argument was persuasive enough to secure minimal resources for continued investigation, but it was clear that without new evidence or witnesses, the case would remain in limbo. In 1993, a national database for violent crimes called VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, became more widely used. Halsey submitted the details of the Townsend murder, hoping to find connections to similar cases across the country. The system identified 3 potentially related cases in different states, all involving young professional women strangled in urban areas between 1978 and 1980. Halsey traveled to Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Indianapolis to review the cases personally. The similarities were intriguing but ultimately circumstantial. None of the other jurisdictions had preserved evidence as meticulously as Chicago had with the Townsend case, limiting the potential for modern forensic comparison. "It's like chasing ghosts," Halsey confided to Morrow after returning from Indianapolis. "I'm convinced these cases are connected, but I can't prove it." "You need to be prepared for the possibility that this case may never be solved," Morrow advised, concern evident in his voice. "It's consuming you, Blake." Halsey acknowledged the truth in his former partner's words, but couldn't bring himself to let go. Every dead end only strengthened his resolve. In 1995, a breakthrough in DNA technology called PCR, polymerase chain reaction amplification, made it possible to generate usable DNA profiles from much smaller samples than previously required. Halsey immediately requested that the blood evidence from the Townsend case be re-examined using this new technique. The results were promising but incomplete. The lab was able to extract a partial DNA profile from the blood found at the scene, confirming it belonged to a male and was not Elaine's. However, the sample was too degraded for a complete profile that could be used for matching purposes. The skin cells found under Elaine's fingernails yielded even less useful information. "It's something," the lab technician offered, seeing Halsey's disappointment, "and the technology keeps improving. What we can't do today, we might be able to do next year, or the year after." This small victory reinvigorated Halsey's commitment to the case. He began reviewing the original witness statements with fresh eyes, particularly focusing on the security guard angle that had emerged from Rufus Meek's belated testimony. In his meticulous review, Halsey noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The button found at the crime scene, which hadn't matched Elaine's clothing, bore a distinctive pattern that he now recognized as similar to those used on security guard uniforms in the late 1970s. He tracked down catalogs from uniform suppliers of that era and confirmed the match. With this connection established, Halsey revisited the employment records of security companies operating in the area at the time of the murder. One name caught his attention: Lyle Patterson, who had worked for Sentinel Security Services from 1977 to 1980. The surname was familiar. Curtis Patterson had been the graduate student questioned during the original investigation. Cross-referencing the records, Halsey confirmed that Lyle was Curtis's uncle. More significantly, Lyle had been assigned to patrol several businesses near the Chicago Public Library during the period when Elaine was killed. This connection had never been made during the initial investigation because Lyle's patrol route had been just outside the radius the detectives had focused on. Halsey tracked down Curtis Patterson, now a professor at a small college in Wisconsin, who confirmed that his uncle had indeed worked as a security guard in Chicago during that time. "Uncle Lyle knew I spent time at the library," Curtis recalled. "He sometimes gave me rides home when our schedules aligned. I don't remember introducing him to Elaine, but it's possible they met if he ever came inside to look for me." This potential connection was tantalizing but still circumstantial. Halsey needed more concrete evidence before he could pursue Lyle Patterson as a serious suspect. He requested employment records that might show whether Lyle had been working on the night of December 17, 1979. The records, when they finally arrived after months of administrative delays, showed that Lyle Patterson had indeed been scheduled to work that evening. His patrol included a bookstore just 2 blocks from the Lakeside Tavern where Elaine had made her phone call. Attempts to locate Lyle Patterson proved challenging. He had left Sentinel Security in early 1980, shortly after Elaine's murder, and his employment history afterward was spotty. His last known address was in Phoenix, Arizona, but he had moved several years earlier with no forwarding information. As Halsey neared retirement age in 1998, the pressure to close his open cases intensified. The department was implementing a new cold case initiative, and all long-term investigations were being reassigned to a specialized unit. "I'm not ready to give it up," Halsey insisted during a meeting with the new chief of detectives, Marcus Reynolds. "Nobody's asking you to give it up," Reynolds assured him. "But the cold case unit will have resources you don't: dedicated lab time, connections to the FBI's databases, officers who can focus exclusively on these investigations without being pulled into current cases." Reluctantly, Halsey agreed to transfer the Townsend case to the new unit. Before doing so, he compiled a comprehensive summary of all evidence, leads, and theories, creating what essentially amounted to a roadmap for any future investigator. His final entry in the case file read, "Elaine Townsend deserves justice. For 19 years, I have carried her case with me, through advances in technology, changes in procedure, and the inevitable march of time. I believe the answer lies in the preserved blood evidence and in the connection to Lyle Patterson, whose whereabouts remain unknown. Modern DNA technology continues to evolve, and what seems impossible today may be routine tomorrow. I pass this torch with the sincere hope that those who carry it forward will maintain the same commitment to finding the truth that has driven me these many years." Dit. On his last day before retirement, Halsey made copies of his notes on the Townsend case, an action technically against department policy, but one he couldn't help taking. He wasn't ready to disconnect entirely from the investigation that had defined much of his career. As Halsey cleaned out his desk, a young detective named Marlene Quintero stopped by to introduce herself. "I've been assigned to the new cold case unit," she explained. "Your Townsend file is one of the first cases I'll be reviewing." Halsey studied her carefully, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the determination in her posture. "What do you know about the case?" he asked, testing her. 28-year-old librarian, strangled in an alley near Lake Michigan in December 1979, Quintero recited. "Blood evidence preserved but yielded only partial DNA profile using mid-90s technology. Possible security guard connection. Primary suspect might be Lyle Patterson, uncle of a library patron, but never located for questioning." Impressed, Halsey nodded. "You've done your homework." "I've read your summary," Quintero acknowledged. "Twice. It's thorough." "There's one thing not in the file," Halsey said, reaching into his box of personal items and retrieving the photograph Caroline had given him years earlier. "This is Elaine, not just a case number or a statistic. Remember that." Quintero accepted the photograph with appropriate solemnity. "I will." As Blake Halsey walked out of the precinct for the last time as an active detective, he felt both a weight lifting from his shoulders and a nagging sense of unfinished business. He had dedicated nearly 2 decades to finding Elaine Townsend's killer, and though he hadn't succeeded, he had kept the case alive, preserving evidence that might someday speak when technology caught up with its potential. What he couldn't have known then was that the Cold Case Unit, with Detective Quintero at the helm of the Townsend investigation, would soon have access to forensic techniques that would transform the landscape of criminal investigation. The partial DNA profile that had seemed insufficient in the late 1990s would, in the coming decades, become a powerful key to unlocking a mystery that had remained unsolved for far too long. As the 20th century drew to a close, the evidence in the Townsend case waited patiently in the department's storage facility, its secrets intact but no longer silent. A new era of criminal investigation was dawning, one in which the smallest traces of biological material could tell stories that had remained hidden for decades. And somewhere, perhaps, Lyle Patterson continued his life, unaware that the shadow of his past was about to catch up with him through advances in science he could never have anticipated. The transition from the 20th to the 21st century marked a pivotal moment in forensic science. What had once been the stuff of science fiction was rapidly becoming standard procedure in police departments across the country. For Detective Marlene Quintero, newly assigned to the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit, these advancements represented hope for cases like Elaine Townsend's. "The unit's philosophy is simple," explained Lieutenant Victor Ramirez during Quintero's orientation in January 2001. "We start with the cases that have the highest probability of resolution using new technology. That means preserved biological evidence is gold." Quintero had spent her first months with the unit familiarizing herself with the cold case files. The Townsend case stood out not only because of Blake Halsey's meticulous documentation, but also because of the preserved blood evidence and skin cells collected from under the victim's fingernails. "Halsey knew what he was doing," Quintero remarked to her colleague, Detective James Washington, as they reviewed the case together. "He made sure these samples were properly stored even before DNA testing was standard procedure." Washington, a veteran investigator with 20 years of experience, nodded appreciatively. Halsey was old school, but he was forward-thinking. He anticipated where forensic science was heading. In March 2001, Quintero formally reopened the Townsend investigation. Her first step was to locate the physical evidence in the department's massive storage facility, a sprawling warehouse containing decades of collected items from thousands of cases. Evidence technician Sofia Rodriguez led Quintero through the labyrinthine aisles of metal shelving. "Cold cases from the late 70s should be in Section D," Rodriguez explained, consulting her inventory database. "Here we go. Townsend, E, Case 794261. The cardboard box was weathered but intact, sealed with evidence tape that had yellowed with age. Inside, carefully packaged and labeled, were the items collected from the crime scene. Blood samples, fingernail scrapings, fibers, the unmatched button, photographs, and the original handwritten notes from Detectives Morrow and Halsey. "Everything's here," Rodriguez confirmed, checking the contents against the inventory list. "And the chain of custody documentation is complete." Halsey made sure of that. Quintero arranged for the biological evidence to be sent to the Illinois State Police Crime Laboratory for advanced DNA testing. The technology had progressed significantly since the partial profile was developed in the mid-1990s. Short tandem repeat STR analysis, which became the FBI's standard for DNA testing in 1997, offered the potential to generate a complete genetic profile from even degraded samples. "We're dealing with biological material that's over 20 years old," cautioned Dr. Anita Park, the forensic scientist assigned to the case. "I can't promise miracles, but we'll apply every technique available." While waiting for the lab results, Quintero pursued other aspects of the investigation. She tracked down former library employees who had worked with Elaine, hoping that time might have loosened tongues or jogged memories. Most had little to add to their original statements, though several remembered Curtis Patterson as a frequent visitor to the reference desk. He always seemed to time his visits for when Elaine was working, recalled Marion Foster, a former circulation desk manager now in her 70s. We used to tease Elaine about her academic admirer. She was polite to him, but never encouraged anything beyond professional interaction. Quintero also attempted to locate Rufus Meeks, the homeless man who had reported seeing Elaine with a security guard on the night of her murder. A search of public records revealed that Meeks had died in 1997 from exposure during a particularly harsh Chicago winter. By June 2001, the lab had completed its initial analysis of the blood evidence. Dr. Park's report confirmed what Halsey had suspected. The blood found at the crime scene did not belong to Elaine Townsend. We've successfully generated a complete STR profile from the blood sample, Dr. Park explained during a briefing with Quintero and Lieutenant Ramirez. It's definitely male. The fingernail scrapings were more challenging due to contamination with the victim's own DNA, but we were able to isolate some foreign genetic material that appears to match the blood profile. This was significant progress, but the next step presented a new challenge. The DNA profile needed to be compared against potential suspects or run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system launched by the FBI in 1998. CODIS contained DNA profiles from convicted offenders, unsolved crime scenes, and missing persons, but its effectiveness was limited by its contents. If the killer had never been convicted of a crime requiring DNA submission, or if their profile had never been entered into the system, there would be no match. Let's start with Curtis Patterson, Quintero suggested. Halsey's notes indicate he was a person of interest, and we know his uncle Lyle worked security in the area. Locating Curtis Patterson was relatively straightforward. He had continued his academic career and was now a tenured professor of American literature at a university in Madison, Wisconsin. After obtaining the necessary legal approvals, Quintero and Washington drove to Madison to interview him and request a voluntary DNA sample. Patterson, now in his 50s with graying hair and reading glasses, received them in his university office. I always wondered if this case would come back around, he admitted, gesturing for them to sit. Detective Halsey was convinced I was hiding something. Were you? Quintero asked directly. Patterson sighed. Not about the murder. I had nothing to do with what happened to Elaine, but I wasn't entirely forthcoming about my feelings for her. I was infatuated, yes. I deliberately sought her out at the library, but she never reciprocated, and I respected that. In turn, when asked about his uncle Lyle, Patterson's demeanor changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight hesitation before responding. Uncle Lyle was complicated. He had a temper. My family didn't talk about it much, but there were incidents when he was younger. Nothing that led to arrests, just situations that required my grandfather's intervention. This information, absent from the original investigation, sparked Quintero's interest. What kind of incidents? Fights, mostly. And there was an accusation from a girlfriend once, but she retracted it after the family got involved. And then Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I haven't seen Lyle in years. There was a falling out with my father sometime in the early 80s. At the conclusion of the interview, Patterson agreed to provide a DNA sample, a simple cheek swab that would allow the lab to compare his genetic profile against the evidence. I want this solved as much as anyone, he insisted. I've lived under a cloud of suspicion for too long. The results came back within weeks. Curtis Patterson was not a match for the DNA found at the crime scene. This eliminated him as the source of the blood, but deepened the mystery surrounding his uncle, whom Halsey had identified as a potential suspect. Locating Lyle Patterson proved significantly more challenging. His last known address in Phoenix was a dead end. He had moved out years earlier, and neighbors had no information about his destination. Traditional investigative methods yielded no current address, employment records, or tax filings. It's like he vanished. Washington commented as they reviewed their failed attempts to track down Lyle Patterson. No credit cards, no property records, no driver's license renewals in any state. Nobody truly vanishes in the modern world, Quintero countered. They just find ways to stay off the grid. Let's approach this from a different angle. Who would Lyle still be in contact with, even if he's trying to stay hidden? This line of thinking led them back to the Patterson family. Curtis had mentioned a falling out between Lyle and his father, but there might be other family members who had maintained contact. Through Curtis, they identified Lyle's younger sister, Eleanor Patterson Walsh, who lived in a retirement community in Florida. In October 2001, Quintero flew to Tampa to interview Eleanor. The elderly woman was initially hesitant to discuss her brother, but gradually opened up as Quintero explained the importance of the investigation. Lyle was always the black sheep, Eleanor admitted, showing Quintero old family photographs. Brilliant, but restless. He couldn't seem to settle into any job or relationship for long. Soon, when asked about Lyle's current whereabouts, Eleanor became evasive. We exchanged Christmas cards. That's about it. He values his privacy. Mrs. Walsh, Quintero said gently but firmly, this is a homicide investigation. If Lyle is innocent, establishing that fact will clear his name. If he's not, then a family has waited over 20 years for justice. Eleanor finally relented, revealing that Lyle had been living under his mother's maiden name, Turner, in a small town near Tucson, Arizona. She hadn't seen him in person for nearly a decade, but had spoken to him by phone the previous month. Armed with this information, Quintero coordinated with the Pima County Sheriff's Department to locate Lyle Patterson, now using the name Lyle Turner. He was found living in a modest mobile home on the outskirts of Tucson, working as a night watchman at a storage facility. Rather than immediately approaching Patterson Turner, Quintero decided on surveillance to establish his patterns and behaviors. The local deputies observed him for a week, reporting that he lived alone, kept mostly to himself, and appeared to have few visitors or friends. Planning to return to Arizona with a properly executed search warrant and DNA collection order, Quintero submitted the case details to CODIS one final time before making the trip. What happened next was unexpected. The system returned a partial match, not to Lyle Patterson, but to an individual named Warren Patterson, who had been convicted of aggravated assault in Nevada in 2003 and had provided a DNA sample as part of his sentencing. A familial match, Dr. Park explained when Quintero called to discuss the result. Warren Patterson isn't your suspect, but he's likely related to him. The genetic markers suggest a close relationship, parent, child, or siblings. Research revealed that Warren Patterson was Lyle Patterson's son, born in 1981 to Lyle's ex-wife shortly after their divorce. Warren had had no contact with his father since early childhood, according to probation records. This development complicated the investigation. The familial DNA match provided circumstantial evidence linking Lyle Patterson to the crime scene, but it wasn't definitive proof. To build a solid case, they would need Lyle's own DNA to compare directly with the evidence. In February 2002, Quintero and Washington traveled to Tucson with local authorities to execute their search warrant. The confrontation with Lyle Patterson was anticlimactic. He offered no resistance when they arrived at his home, though he refused to speak without an attorney present. Mr. Patterson, we have a warrant to collect DNA samples from you as part of a homicide investigation, Quintero explained, as a technician prepared to take cheek swabs. Patterson, now in his 60s with weathered skin and thinning grey hair, said nothing, his face impassive as the samples were collected. Only when they were preparing to leave did he break his silence. "Took you long enough," he muttered, just loud enough for Quintero to hear. The DNA comparison was conclusive. Lyle Patterson's genetic profile matched the blood found at the scene of Elaine Townsend's murder in 1979. The fingernail scrapings also contained his DNA, placing him in direct physical contact with Elaine during a struggle. Despite this evidence, the case against Patterson faced significant hurdles. More than 2 decades had passed. Witnesses had died or moved away, and memories had faded. The chain of events leading to Elaine's murder remained unclear, and Patterson maintained his innocence through his attorney. In April 2002, Lyle Patterson was extradited to Illinois and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the DNA evidence, supplemented by the button-matching security guard uniforms, Rufus Meek's original statement about seeing a security guard with Elaine, and the circumstantial evidence of Patterson's hasty departure from Chicago shortly after the murder. The defense attacked the reliability of the evidence, questioning the chain of custody over such a long period and suggesting that contamination might have occurred. They also pointed out that Patterson had no known connection to Elaine Townsend beyond working in the vicinity of the library. As the case proceeded through preliminary hearings, a surprising development emerged. Curtis Patterson, after learning of his uncle's arrest, came forward with additional information. He admitted that he had introduced Elaine to his uncle once, when Lyle had picked him up from the library. More significantly, he revealed that Lyle had known about his infatuation with Elaine and had offered to put in a good word for him. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Curtis testified, "but looking back, there was something unsettling about the way he talked about her, like she was an object to be acquired rather than a person." This testimony strengthened the prosecution's theory that Lyle Patterson had approached Elaine on the night of her murder, possibly using his nephew's name to gain her trust. The scenario fit with Elaine's phone call to her roommate, saying she had arranged a ride home. As the trial date approached, Patterson's attorney proposed a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to second-degree murder, Patterson would receive a reduced sentence. After consultation with Elaine's family, the prosecution accepted the deal. In October 2002, Lyle Patterson stood before Judge Teresa Ramirez and admitted to killing Elaine Townsend. His statement, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, described meeting Elaine outside the tavern, offering her a ride, and then making unwanted advances. When she rejected him and threatened to tell his employers about his behavior, he strangled her in a rage. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Patterson claimed, though his lack of remorse was evident to everyone in the courtroom. "It was a mistake." Judge Ramirez sentenced Patterson to the maximum allowed under the plea agreement, 20 years in prison. With time served and considering his age, he would likely spend the remainder of his life behind bars. For Detective Marlene Quintero, the resolution brought mixed emotions. Justice had finally been served, but the decades-long delay meant that those most invested in the case, including Blake Halsey, had waited far too long for closure. After the sentencing, Quintero visited Halsey at his retirement home to share the news in person. The former detective, now in his 70s and suffering from early-stage Parkinson's disease, listened intently as she detailed the investigation and its outcome. "DNA," Halsey mused, shaking his head in wonder. "We knew the blood would be the key, but we didn't have the tools back then. Science caught up with him eventually." "Your work made this possible," Quintero assured him. "You preserved the evidence correctly. You documented everything. You kept the case alive when others would have let it fade away." Halsey smiled faintly. "What about the other cases? The similar murders in Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Indianapolis that I thought might be connected?" "Oh, we're reopening those investigations," Quintero confirmed. "Patterson lived in Milwaukee briefly in 1978, and his work as a security guard took him to various cities. We're coordinating with those jurisdictions to re-examine their evidence." As she prepared to leave, Quintero handed Halsey a photograph, the same one of Elaine that he had given her when he retired. "I thought you might want this back." Halsey studied the image for a long moment, then shook his head. "Keep it. Put it somewhere in the cold case unit. Let it remind you and the others that patience and persistence matter. That science evolves, but good detective work is timeless." The Townsend case became a landmark for the cold case unit. demonstrating the potential of combining traditional investigative techniques with modern forensic science. In the years that followed, similar methods would unlock more decades-old mysteries, bringing justice to victims long forgotten by all but those who had loved them. For Elaine Townsend, justice had been delayed, but not denied. Her case, preserved through Blake Halsey's dedication and resolved through Marlene Quintero's persistence, stood as testament to the principle that no murder should ever be considered truly unsolvable. As DNA technology continued to advance through the early 2000s, the implications for cold case investigations expanded dramatically. What had been accomplished in the Townsend case, extracting a usable DNA profile from decades-old evidence, was just the beginning of a forensic revolution that would transform the criminal justice system. But even as this case closed, another chapter in forensic science was beginning to unfold, one that would take the concept of DNA identification far beyond what investigators like Quintero could have imagined at the time. The ability to identify not just exact matches, but distant genetic relatives through public databases would soon create a new frontier in solving the unsolvable, catching criminals who had eluded justice for decades. And for families still waiting for answers about their loved ones, these advances offered something that had been in short supply: hope that the truth would eventually come to light, no matter how long it took. By 2018, the landscape of forensic investigation had transformed dramatically. What had once been considered revolutionary, extracting and analyzing DNA from crime scene evidence, was now standard procedure. But a new frontier had emerged, one that would rewrite the rules of cold case investigation yet again: genetic genealogy. The Chicago Police Department's cold case unit had undergone its own evolution since the resolution of the Elaine Townsend case. Detective Marlene Quintero had risen to head the unit, overseeing a team of investigators specializing in unsolved homicides. The success of the Townsend case had brought attention and resources to the unit, allowing them to apply new technologies to cases that had previously seemed unsolvable. On a crisp October morning, Quintero received a call from Dr. Troy Whitaker, the newly appointed director of the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Laboratory. "Detective Quintero," Whitaker began, his voice betraying an unusual excitement for the typically reserved scientist. "I've been reviewing some of our cold cases with an eye toward applying genetic genealogy techniques. The Townsend case caught my attention." "Townsend?" Quintero was surprised. "That case was closed in 2002. Lyle Patterson confessed and was sentenced." "I know," Whitaker acknowledged, "but it presents an interesting opportunity. Patterson died in prison last year, and the case has all the elements we need: well-preserved DNA evidence, a conclusive identification, and a resolution that's not in dispute. It's perfect for validating our new methodologies." Whitaker explained that genetic genealogy, the practice of using commercial DNA databases and family tree research to identify unknown individuals, had recently solved several high-profile cold cases across the country. The most notable was the identification of the Golden State Killer in California earlier that year, a breakthrough that had captured national attention. "We're establishing protocols for applying these techniques to our unsolved cases," Whitaker continued. "But before we deploy them widely, we want to validate the methodology with a case where we already know the outcome. If genetic genealogy leads us to Lyle Patterson in the Townsend case, we can be confident in applying it to truly unsolved crimes." Quintero was intrigued. "What do you need from me?" "Access to the original DNA evidence and case files," Whitaker replied. "We'll run a blind study. Our genealogist won't know the identity of the perpetrator. We want to see if the process leads us to Patterson independently." Within days, the necessary approvals were secured and the experiment began. The forensic team extracted DNA from the original blood samples and converted it to the type of data used by commercial ancestry services. This data was then provided to forensic genetic genealogist Dr. Zoe Sullivan, who had joined the lab specifically to develop this new investigative approach. Sullivan had no prior knowledge of the Townsend case or its resolution. She was given only the DNA profile and told it belonged to the perpetrator of an unsolved homicide. Her task was to identify potential suspects using genetic genealogy techniques. The process began with uploading the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where people who had tested their DNA through commercial services like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA could upload their results for additional analysis. The database was used by genealogy enthusiasts searching for relatives, but it had recently become a powerful tool for law enforcement. "We're not looking for an exact match," Sullivan explained during a briefing with Quintero and Whitaker. "We're looking for distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, anyone who shares enough DNA with our unknown subject to establish a family connection. Then we build family trees and work forward to identify potential suspects." The upload yielded several matches, none closer than third cousins, but sufficient to begin the painstaking process of constructing family trees. Sullivan spent weeks researching birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, and social media profiles, gradually assembling a complex network of relationships. "I've identified a common ancestral couple from the 1880s, Sullivan reported after a month of work. "Based on the shared DNA segments, our unknown subject descends from this couple through their son, William Patterson." Quintero and Whitaker exchanged glances at the mention of the Patterson surname. Sullivan, unaware of the significance, continued her presentation, outlining how she had traced the Patterson family forward through time, identifying branches that matched the geographical distribution and age range suggested by the DNA matches. "I've narrowed it down to this family group," Sullivan concluded, pointing to a section of her elaborate family tree. "The DNA suggests our unknown subject is in this branch, descended from Thomas Patterson, who moved from Kentucky to the Midwest in the 1930s. He had 3 sons, Richard, Thomas Jr., and Gerald. And have you identified a specific individual?" Whitaker asked, careful to maintain the blind nature of the study. Sullivan nodded. "Based on the age range, geographic locations, and the strength of the DNA matches, I believe our unknown subject is likely to be one of these 2 men." She circled 2 names on her chart, Lyle Patterson and his brother Norman Patterson. "You've identified Lyle Patterson as one of 2 potential suspects?" Quintero confirmed, impressed despite having expected this outcome. "Yes," Sullivan replied. "Given the time frame of the crime, both brothers would have been the right age, and both lived in Chicago during the relevant period. Norman moved to Seattle in 1977, which makes Lyle the more likely suspect. But without more information about the crime, I can't eliminate Norman entirely." The experiment had succeeded beyond expectations. Starting with nothing but a DNA profile, Sullivan had independently narrowed down the pool of potential suspects to include the actual perpetrator. Moreover, she had done so without access to any traditional investigative information, no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the DNA, no knowledge of the crime itself. "This validates our methodology," Whitaker declared, finally revealing to Sullivan that Lyle Patterson had indeed been the killer. "If we can apply this to our unsolved cases, we could identify perpetrators who have evaded justice for decades." For Quintero, the implications were profound. How many cases could this help us solve? "Potentially hundreds, just in Illinois," Whitaker estimated. "Any case with preserved DNA evidence could be revisited, and the technique becomes more powerful as more people add their DNA to these databases." The successful validation of genetic genealogy techniques led to the formation of a specialized team within the cold case unit, combining the expertise of detectives, forensic scientists, and genetic genealogists. The Illinois State Police dedicated resources to re-examining unsolved homicides with preserved biological evidence, prioritizing the oldest cases first. Among these was a series of unsolved murders from the early 1980s, 3 women killed in different Chicago suburbs between 1981 and 1983. Traditional DNA analysis had confirmed they were killed by the same person, but no match had ever been found in CODIS. Dr. Sullivan applied the same techniques she had used in the Townsend validation study. After uploading the DNA profile to GEDmatch, she identified several distant cousins of the unknown subject. The family trees were more complex in this case, and the common ancestors more distant, requiring months of meticulous research. By early 2019, Sullivan had traced the DNA to a family with connections to Milwaukee. The genetic evidence points to the Peterson family, she reported, specifically descendants of Margaret Peterson, who had 5 children between 1925 and 1935. This information allowed detectives to focus their investigation on a specific family, examining which members had connections to the Chicago area during the early 1980s. Through public records, they identified Curtis Peterson, grandson of Margaret, who had worked as a delivery driver with roots through the Chicago suburbs during the exact time frame of the murders. Peterson, now in his 70s and living in a nursing home, was placed under surveillance. Detectives collected a discarded coffee cup after a family member's visit, providing a DNA sample that confirmed Peterson as the source of the DNA found at all 3 murder scenes. When confronted with the evidence, Peterson confessed, claiming he had forgotten about the murders due to advancing dementia. He was charged and eventually deemed mentally unfit to stand trial, but the identification brought closure to the victims' families after nearly 4 decades of uncertainty. The success of these cases brought national attention to the Chicago Cold Case Unit's work with genetic genealogy. Quintero was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country, sharing their protocols and successes. "We're entering a new era in cold case investigation," she told attendees at the FBI's Cold Case Symposium in Quantico. "DNA evidence has always been powerful, but genetic genealogy exponentially expands its reach. It's no longer necessary to have the perpetrator's DNA in a database. We just need distant relatives who have voluntarily uploaded their own genetic information." This new approach wasn't without controversy. Privacy advocates raised concerns about law enforcement's use of databases that were primarily intended for genealogy hobbyists and people searching for their biological relatives. Some commercial DNA testing companies responded by requiring users to explicitly opt in to law enforcement searches, reducing the pool of potential matches. Despite these challenges, the technique continued to yield results. By mid-2023, the Chicago Cold Case Unit had resolved 12 previously unsolved homicides using genetic genealogy, some dating back to the 1960s. Each successful identification reinforced the message that no case was truly cold, as long as biological evidence remained preserved. In October 2023, as the unit celebrated its 5th anniversary of using genetic genealogy, Quintero received an unexpected call from Dr. Sullivan. "I've been doing some additional research on the Patterson family tree from our validation study," Sullivan began. "Something interesting has come up that I thought you should know." "I'm listening," Quintero replied, curious about why Sullivan would revisit a closed case. "When we did the original study, I identified Lyle Patterson as one of 2 potential suspects, the other being his brother Norman," Sullivan explained. "At the time, I noted that Norman had moved to Seattle in 1977, which made Lyle the more likely suspect for a Chicago homicide in 1979. "That's right," Quintero confirmed. "And we already knew Lyle was the killer, so the identification was correct." "Yes, but here's where it gets interesting," Sullivan continued. "I've been refining our methodologies, looking at how we can more precisely predict relationships from DNA. As part of that work, I revisited some of our older cases, including Townsend. When I re-examined the DNA profile with our updated algorithms, something stood out. Sullivan explained that advances in genetic analysis now allowed for more detailed examination of the Y chromosome, which passes virtually unchanged from father to son. The Y DNA profile extracted from the Townsend crime scene evidence showed a distinctive marker that was inconsistent with other Patterson men whose DNA was now in various databases. "What are you saying?" Quintero asked, sensing the direction of Sullivan's discovery. "I'm saying that there's a possibility Lyle Patterson wasn't actually a biological Patterson," Sullivan replied carefully. "The Y DNA suggests there may have been a non-paternity event, what we used to call an adoption or illegitimacy, somewhere in his direct paternal line." This revelation was scientifically interesting, but seemed to have little practical importance for the Townsend case, which had been definitively solved. However, Sullivan wasn't finished. "Here's where it gets relevant to your work," she continued. "I cross-referenced this distinctive Y DNA profile with other unsolved cases in our database. We got a match to an unidentified DNA sample from a 1977 homicide in Milwaukee, a case with striking similarities to the Townsend murder." Quintero felt a chill of recognition. Blake Halsey suspected there might be connected cases in Milwaukee. He traveled there in the early 90s to investigate potential links. "It looks like he was right," Sullivan confirmed. "The Y DNA is identical, indicating the same paternal lineage. The autosomal DNA shows a match that would be consistent with the same individual committing both crimes." This discovery prompted Quintero to re-examine Halsey's notes about the potential connected cases. The Milwaukee victim had also been a young professional woman, strangled in an alley. Halsey had noted the similarities, but had been unable to establish a definitive connection with the forensic techniques available at the time. Quintero contacted the Milwaukee Police Department's cold case unit, sharing Sullivan's findings and requesting access to their case files. Detective Marcus Reynolds, who headed Milwaukee's unit, was immediately receptive. "We've never forgotten about Janet Reeves," Reynolds said, referring to the 1977 victim. "If there's a chance to finally identify her killer, we're all in." A joint task force was established, combining resources and expertise from both departments. They discovered that Lyle Patterson had indeed lived in Milwaukee from 1975 to 1977, working for the same security company that later transferred him to Chicago. He had left Milwaukee abruptly, just weeks after Janet Reeves's murder. Further investigation revealed additional evidence linking Patterson to the Reeves case. A witness had reported seeing a man in a security guard uniform near the crime scene, a detail that echoed Rufus Meek's statement in the Townsend case. The button found at the Townsend scene matched buttons that were missing from Reeves' clothing, suggesting Patterson may have kept it as a trophy. By January 2024, DNA evidence and circumstantial connections had linked Lyle Patterson to 4 unsolved homicides across 3 states, all following a similar pattern. Young professional women strangled in urban areas, with the killer targeting victims near their workplaces. Lyle Patterson was a serial killer, Quintero concluded during a joint press conference with representatives from the affected jurisdictions. The scientific advancements that allowed us to confirm his identity through genetic genealogy have now revealed the true extent of his crimes. For the families of the additional victims, the identification brought long-awaited answers. For the investigative community, it demonstrated the power of combining traditional detective work with cutting-edge science. And for Detective Marlene Quintero, it validated Blake Halsey's long-held suspicions about connected cases. "Blake knew," she told Troy Whitaker, as they reviewed the collective evidence. "He sensed the pattern decades ago, but the technology hadn't caught up with his instincts. That's what makes cold case work so important," Whitaker replied. "Evidence preserved today may speak volumes tomorrow, with tools we haven't even imagined yet." As 2024 progressed, the collaboration between traditional detective work and genetic genealogy continued to evolve. The successes in the Patterson cases led to increased funding for cold case units nationwide and accelerated the development of specialized training programs for investigators and forensic scientists. The message to perpetrators of unsolved crimes became increasingly clear. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how careful they had been, the combination of preserved evidence and advancing technology meant that justice, though delayed, was becoming increasingly inevitable. For the Chicago Cold Case Unit, the journey that had begun with Elaine Townsend's case in 1979 had come full circle. The dedication of investigators like Blake Halsey, who refused to let the case fade away, had preserved the evidence that would eventually speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. And as genetic science continued its rapid advancement, the next chapter in forensic investigation was already being written, one that would challenge the very notion that any crime could truly remain unsolved forever. By early 2023, the revelation that Lyle Patterson had been responsible for multiple homicides across 3 states had fundamentally changed the scope of the investigation. What had begun as the resolution of a single cold case had expanded into a hunt for potentially undiscovered victims spanning nearly 5 decades. If Patterson killed in Chicago and Milwaukee, there's a strong possibility he didn't stop there, Detective Marlene Quintero explained to her expanded task force, now including representatives from the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP. Serial offenders rarely limit themselves to 2 incidents, especially when they've gone undetected. The Joint Task Force established a timeline of Lyle Patterson's life, tracking his movements across the country from birth to death. Employment records, rental agreements, traffic citations, and credit card statements painted a picture of a man who had lived in 12 different cities between 1970 and his arrest in 2002. "We're looking at a nomadic existence," observed FBI Special Agent Dominic Vega, who specialized in behavioral analysis. Patterson never stayed in one place longer than 3 years. He changed jobs frequently, often working in positions that gave him access to potential victims: security guard, night watchman, apartment maintenance worker. This pattern of movement complicated the investigation. Each location Patterson had lived in required scrutiny of unsolved homicides during his period of residence. The task force created a database of cases with similarities to the confirmed Patterson murders: female victims, strangulation, limited evidence of sexual assault, bodies found in urban alleys or similar locations. The genetic evidence that had connected Patterson to the Milwaukee and Chicago murders provided a crucial investigative tool. Any case with preserved biological evidence could potentially be tested for a match to Patterson's DNA profile. However, many older cases had insufficient evidence preserved, or what had been collected had degraded beyond usefulness. In March 2023, Dr. Troy Whitaker presented a new avenue of investigation to the task force. "We've been focusing on Patterson himself, but genetic genealogy offers us another approach. If we can't find Patterson's DNA at other crime scenes, perhaps we can find his relatives' DNA in commercial databases that might lead us to more victims." This innovative approach involved searching for distant relatives of Patterson who had uploaded their DNA to public genealogy databases, then using those connections to identify potential victims in locations where these relatives had lived. The theory was that Patterson might have targeted victims in areas where he was visiting family, not just in places where he had established residence. Dr. Zoe Sullivan took the lead on this aspect of the investigation, searching through genealogical records to create a comprehensive family tree for Lyle Patterson. The Y chromosome anomaly I identified earlier suggests there may be something unusual in Patterson's paternal lineage, she reminded the team. This could actually help us, as it creates a distinctive genetic marker to look for. Sullivan's research revealed something unexpected. Lyle Patterson's father, Thomas Patterson, had been born Thomas Wells. He had changed his surname after being adopted by the Patterson family at age 10, following his biological father's imprisonment for violent crimes in 1938. This explains the Y chromosome discrepancy, Sullivan reported. Lyle's Y DNA doesn't match the Patterson family because his paternal lineage is actually from the Wells family. This discovery opened a new line of investigation. Research into the Wells family history revealed a disturbing pattern of violence and criminal behavior spanning several generations. Lyle's biological grandfather, Raymond Wells, had died in prison while serving a sentence for attacking a woman in Kentucky. Raymond's father had been suspected in the disappearance of 2 women in the 1920s, but never charged due to insufficient evidence. We could be looking at an intergenerational pattern of violence against women, Agent Vega suggested. Sometimes these behaviors have both genetic and environmental components, nature and nurture working together in the worst possible way. While this historical research was illuminating, the task force remained focused on identifying additional victims of Lyle Patterson himself. By cross-referencing Patterson's known locations with unsolved homicides matching his victim profile and methodology, they identified 27 potential cases spanning from 1975 to 2000. "We need to prioritize," Quintero instructed. "Focus first on cases where biological evidence was preserved and is still available for testing." Of the 27 potential cases, only 11 had usable DNA evidence. These samples were sent to the FBI laboratory for comparison with Patterson's profile. The results, which came back in batches over several months, were both validating and sobering. 5 of the 11 cases showed a definitive match to Lyle Patterson. "We're now looking at a total of 7 confirmed victims," Quintero announced during a task force briefing in August 2023. 2 in Chicago, 1 in Milwaukee, 1 in St. Louis, 1 in Indianapolis, and 2 in Phoenix. The earliest killing was in 1975, the latest in 1998. That's a 23-year span of active predation. For each confirmed victim, the task force notified families and local law enforcement, bringing closure to cases that had remained open for decades. The emotional impact of these notifications was profound. Some families expressed relief at finally knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Others felt renewed grief as old wounds were reopened. Caroline Townsend, Elaine's sister, who had maintained contact with the investigation since 1979, became an unexpected ally in the expanded investigation. Now in her 60s, Caroline had become an advocate for families of homicide victims and had founded a support network for those affected by cold cases. "Each of these women was someone's Elaine," she told Quintero during a meeting at the Chicago Police Department. "Each family has lived with the same questions that haunted me for decades. They deserve the same answers, the same closure." With Caroline's assistance, the task force established a protocol for approaching families of potential Patterson victims, ensuring that notifications were handled with sensitivity and that ongoing support was available afterward. Caroline often accompanied detectives during these difficult conversations, offering a perspective that only someone who had walked the same path could provide. As 2023 drew to a close, the task force turned its attention to the 16 potential cases that lacked DNA evidence for direct comparison. For these cases, they relied on geographic proximity, timeline consistency, and similarities in victim profile and method. While these factors couldn't provide the certainty of a DNA match, they could establish Patterson as a strong suspect. In January 2024, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Warren Patterson, Lyle's son, who had been identified through the familial DNA match in the original investigation, contacted the task force after seeing news coverage of his father's crimes. "I didn't know him," Warren explained during his interview with Quintero and Agent Vega. "He left when I was an infant. My mother never talked about him and I never tried to find him, but after seeing the reports, I realized I might have information that could help. Warren revealed that his mother had maintained a box of items Lyle had left behind when he abandoned them in 1982. Among these items were photographs, letters, and a small notebook. Warren had discovered the box after his mother's death in 2017, but had paid little attention to its contents until now. "There's something about the notebook that seems off," Warren admitted. "It's mostly just dates and initials, but the way they're organized felt significant somehow." The notebook, which Warren provided to the task force, contained entries spanning from 1975 to 1999. Each entry consisted of a date, a two-letter combination, and occasionally a brief notation such as blonde or blue coat. There were 23 entries in total. "We've confirmed 7 victims," Quintero noted, studying the notebook. "If each entry represents a victim, we could be looking at 16 additional homicides." Forensic analysis of the notebook confirmed it had been in Lyle Patterson's possession. His fingerprints were found on multiple pages, and the handwriting matched known samples of his writing. The ink used in the earlier entries was consistent with pens manufactured in the 1970s, suggesting the entries had been made contemporaneously with the events they might represent. The task force cross-referenced the dates in the notebook with unsolved homicides in locations where Patterson was known to have been at the time. In several cases, they found matches. Women murdered on or near the dates listed in cities where Patterson had lived or visited. The two-letter combinations presented a more challenging puzzle. Initially thought to be victims' initials, they didn't always correspond to the names of known or suspected victims. After extensive analysis, Dr. Sullivan proposed an alternative theory. "I believe these are location codes, not initials," she explained. "CH for Chicago, MK for Milwaukee, SL for St. Louis. The pattern holds for all our confirmed cases." This insight allowed the task force to focus their efforts on specific geographic areas corresponding to the unidentified location codes. They identified potential matches for 12 of the 16 unconfirmed notebook entries. Though without DNA evidence, these connections remained circumstantial. In April 2024, the investigation took another unexpected turn when a retired security guard named Victor Ramirez contacted the Chicago Police Department after seeing news coverage of the Patterson case. "I worked with Lyle at Sentinel Security in the late 70s, Ramirez told Quintero during their interview. "We weren't friends, but we worked the same shift for about 6 months. There was something I remembered after seeing his picture on the news." Ramirez recalled that Patterson had maintained a collection of small items he kept in his locker, buttons, earrings, and other trinkets that he claimed to have found during his security rounds. He called them his lost and found, but he never turned them into management like we were supposed to, Ramirez explained. "I thought it was weird, but I never imagined they might be souvenirs." This information aligned with the button found at the Townsend crime scene and similar items recovered in other confirmed Patterson cases. The task force theorized that Patterson had taken trophies from his victims, small, personal items that wouldn't immediately be connected to the crimes. Armed with this understanding, investigators revisited the evidence from suspected Patterson cases, looking specifically for missing personal items that might have been taken as trophies. In several instances, victims' families had reported seemingly insignificant items missing: a unique button from a coat, a single earring, a distinctive hair clip. By September 2024, the comprehensive investigation had established Lyle Patterson as one of the most prolific serial killers identified through genetic genealogy. The evidence suggested he was responsible for at least 15 homicides between 1975 and 1999, with another 8 cases where he remained the primary suspect, despite insufficient evidence for a definitive conclusion. "What we're seeing is a predator who evolved over time," Agent Vega explained during a briefing with law enforcement agencies nationwide. "He learned from each crime, became more careful about leaving evidence, and adjusted his methodology to avoid detection. Without the advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy, he might never have been identified at all. For Detective Marlene Quintero, the expanded investigation reinforced the importance of preserving evidence in cold cases, regardless of how limited the immediate prospects for resolution might seem. Every sample we save, every piece of evidence we properly store, is a potential key to future justice, she emphasized in training sessions with younger detectives. The Patterson investigation also highlighted the value of collaboration across jurisdictions. What had begun as a single cold case in Chicago had expanded to include agencies from multiple states, federal resources, and scientific expertise from various disciplines. This collaborative model became a template for future cold case initiatives nationwide. In October 2024, the task force held its final briefing. With Lyle Patterson deceased and the extent of his crimes thoroughly documented, the active investigation was concluding. The findings would be maintained in a database accessible to law enforcement nationwide, allowing for future connections if new evidence emerged. "This isn't truly an ending," Quintero told the assembled team. "It's a transition. We've learned too much about Patterson's movements and methods to consider this case closed, while there's still the possibility of undiscovered victims." For Blake Halsey, now 83 and in declining health, the culmination of the investigation brought a measure of peace. Quintero visited him at his nursing home to share the final report, bringing with her Caroline Townsend, who had remained in contact with Halsey over the decades. "You were right all along," Quintero told him, placing the comprehensive file on his lap. "Those connections you suspected in Milwaukee and other cities, you saw the pattern before anyone else." Halsey, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the file, smiled faintly. "Just good detective work," he murmured, following the evidence wherever it led. Caroline took his hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "You never gave up on Elaine," she said softly, "and because of that, all these other families have answers too." As Quintero prepared to leave, Halsey motioned her closer. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Warren Patterson. Have you thought about what this means for him?" Quintero nodded, understanding the implication. Warren had provided crucial assistance to the investigation, despite the personal trauma of discovering his father's horrific crimes. "We're keeping in touch with him," she assured Halsey. "He's working with a therapist specializing in trauma and family violence. And he's been in contact with some of the victims' families, not because he feels responsible, but because he wants to help, however he can." "Good," Halsey nodded. "Remember, the ripples from these cases extend far beyond the immediate victims. Every homicide creates concentric circles of trauma: family, friends, communities. Part of our job is recognizing those circles and doing what we can to help them heal." This perspective, seeing beyond the immediate case to its wider human impact, had been central to Halsey's approach throughout his career. It was a philosophy Quintero had adopted and now passed on to younger detectives in the unit. As 2024 drew to a close, the Patterson investigation was featured in criminology textbooks, forensic science journals, and law enforcement training programs. It represented a culmination of decades of evolving investigative techniques, from the meticulous evidence preservation of the 1970s to the cutting-edge genetic genealogy of the 2020s. For the families of Lyle Patterson's victims, the resolution brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief at finally knowing the truth, grief renewed by fresh details, and for some, frustration that Patterson had died in prison before the full extent of his crimes was known, denying them the closure of seeing him held accountable. For the investigators who had dedicated years to the case, there was professional satisfaction in a job thoroughly done, tempered by the sobering recognition of how long justice had been delayed. and there was a renewed commitment to ensuring that other cold cases received the attention and resources they deserved. As Detective Marlene Quintero looked toward 2025, she reflected on the journey from that first meeting with Blake Halsey upon his retirement to the international task force the Patterson case had eventually required. The technology had advanced dramatically, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Follow the evidence, preserve what you find, and never forget that behind every case file is a human story deserving of resolution. The trail of time had finally led to justice, but the path forward remained clear. For every case solved, many more awaited their turn, and with each technological advancement, the definition of unsolvable continued to shrink, offering hope to families still waiting for answers and accountability to those who had believed their crimes would remain forever hidden in the shadows of the past. January 2025 arrived with a blanket of fresh snow across Chicago, transforming the urban landscape into a momentary canvas of pristine white. For Detective Marlene Quintero, gazing out her office window at the transformed cityscape, the snow served as an apt metaphor for the case that had defined much of her career. A cold, seemingly immutable surface that had concealed crucial evidence beneath, waiting patiently for the right moment to be revealed. The Patterson investigation had officially concluded 3 months earlier, with a comprehensive report distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. 15 murders had been definitively attributed to Lyle Patterson through DNA evidence, with another 8 cases where circumstantial evidence strongly indicated his involvement. The trail of victims spanned from 1975 to 1999, crossing 6 states and 12 cities. Yet despite the formal closure, the case continued to reverberate through the justice system and the lives of everyone it had touched. On this particular morning, Quintero was preparing for what would likely be the final significant event related to the investigation: a joint press conference with prosecutors from Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, Indiana, Arizona, and Nevada, all states where Patterson had claimed victims. "Are you ready for this?" asked James Washington, who had worked alongside Quintero throughout the investigation and now served as her deputy in the cold case unit. "It's going to be quite the media circus." Quintero nodded, adjusting the collar of her blazer. 23 families have waited decades for this moment. Some thought it would never come. They deserve to see the full acknowledgement of what happened to their loved ones. The press conference, held in the Grand Hall of Chicago's City Hall, drew national media attention. Representatives from each affected jurisdiction were present, along with family members of Patterson's victims. Caroline Townsend, now the unofficial spokesperson for these families, would also address the gathering. At precisely 10 a.m., Illinois Attorney General Sophia Chen approached the podium, flanked by her colleagues from the other states. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "Today, we stand before you to formally announce the resolution of one of the most extensive serial murder investigations in American history," Chen stated, her voice steady and measured. "Through unprecedented cooperation across multiple jurisdictions and the application of groundbreaking forensic techniques, we can now confirm that Lyle Patterson, who died in Illinois State Prison in 2017, was responsible for at least 15 homicides committed between 1975 and 1999. Chen detailed the investigation's progression from the original Townsend case to the eventual identification of Patterson's other victims. She acknowledged the pivotal roles played by Detective Blake Halsey in preserving crucial evidence in the 1970s, Detective Marlene Quintero in reviving and expanding the investigation, and the forensic scientists whose expertise had made the identifications possible. "This case represents both a failure and a triumph of our justice system," Chen continued. "A failure in that these crimes went undetected and unpunished for so long, and a triumph in that persistence, scientific advancement, and cooperative investigation eventually revealed the truth. Each state's representative then spoke briefly, acknowledging the victims from their jurisdictions and the local investigators who had never closed the cases, despite years without progress. They emphasized that the official records would now reflect Patterson as the confirmed or presumptive perpetrator in each case, providing a measure of resolution for the families and communities affected. When it was Caroline Townsend's turn to speak, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. At 68, Caroline carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had transformed personal tragedy into purpose. She had become a nationally recognized advocate for families of homicide victims, particularly in cold cases, and had established a foundation that provided both emotional support and financial assistance for these families. "My sister Elaine was 28 when Lyle Patterson took her life," Caroline began, her voice soft but unwavering. "She was a librarian who loved books, classical music, and spring rain. She had plans for graduate school, dreams of traveling to Europe, and a gift for making people feel truly heard when they spoke to her. On December 17, 1979, all of that was stolen, not just from Elaine, but from everyone who loved her and everyone whose life she would have touched." Caroline paused, looking across the room at the other family members present. "Each person here has a similar story. We have all lived with questions that seemed unanswerable, with grief that had no resolution, with the knowledge that someone had violently ended a precious life and simply walked away. Today does not erase that pain, but it does something almost as important. It names it. It acknowledges it. It tells us and the world that our loved ones have not been forgotten, and that the pursuit of justice, however delayed, did not falter." As the press conference concluded, Quintero found herself surrounded by reporters seeking additional comments. She kept her responses brief and focused on the collaborative nature of the investigation, deflecting questions about Patterson's psychology or the gruesome details of the crimes. Her priority remained the dignity of the victims and their families. After the media dispersed, a small, more intimate gathering took place in a conference room adjacent to the main hall. Here, the families of Patterson's victims met with the key investigators in a setting free from cameras and microphones. Many had never met each other before, despite the shared thread of tragedy that connected them across decades and distances. "I've waited 47 years to know who killed my daughter," said Eleanor Reeves, mother of Janet Reeves, Patterson's 1977 victim in Milwaukee. At 92, she was the oldest family member present, having lived almost half her life with the unsolved murder of her child. "I never thought I'd live to see this day." "None of us did," agreed Michael Donovan, brother of Patricia Donovan, killed in St. Louis in 1983. "After the first decade, you start to accept that you might never know. After the second, you almost convince yourself it doesn't matter anymore, but it does. It always did." Throughout the afternoon, stories were shared, tears shed, and connections formed that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Quintero observed the interactions with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal emotion. This, she reflected, was the true measure of their work, not just in solving cases, but in helping to heal the wounds they left behind. As the gathering began to disperse, Quintero received an unexpected message. Blake Halsey had been admitted to the hospital that morning. His condition was described as serious but stable. Without hesitation, she excused herself and headed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She found Halsey in a private room, connected to monitors and an oxygen line. Despite his frail appearance, his eyes brightened when she entered. "Shouldn't you be at the press conference?" he asked, his voice thin but alert. "It's over," Quintero replied, taking a seat beside his bed. "It went well. Caroline gave a beautiful speech. The families are together now, sharing stories." Halsey nodded slowly. "Good, that's good." He paused, seeming to gather his strength. "I wanted to hold on for this, to see it through to the end." Quintero felt a tightening in her chest at his words. "This isn't the end, Blake. We're still working other cold cases. The unit is expanding." The techniques we pioneered with the Patterson investigation are being applied nationwide. I know, Halsey smiled faintly. But this one, Elaine, she was special. My white whale. He gestured weakly toward the window. I had a dream last night. I was young again, standing in that alley where we found her. But this time, she was there too, alive, smiling. She said, "It's finished now. You can rest." Quintero took his hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent veins beneath her fingers. "You never gave up on her. That's why we got here. Because you preserved the evidence, kept detailed notes, maintained contact with her family. You laid the foundation for everything that followed." "We got him," Halsey murmured, his eyes drifting closed momentarily. "All of them. Not just Elaine. All those women." "Yes," Quintero confirmed. 15 confirmed, 8 more highly probable. One of the most significant cold case resolutions in history. Halsey was quiet for a long moment, his breathing shallow but steady. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What happens now? To the evidence, the files. They'll be maintained in a special archive," Quintero explained. "Available for review if new cases emerge that might be connected, or if families have questions in the future. And we're developing a training program based on the investigation, teaching new detectives about evidence preservation, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and integrating traditional detective work with advanced forensics." The Townsend Protocol," Halsey suggested, a hint of his old humor returning briefly. "That's not a bad name for it," Quintero agreed, squeezing his hand gently. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse who needed to check Halsey's vital signs. Quintero stepped into the hallway, where she found an unexpected visitor waiting, Warren Patterson, Lyle's son, who had provided crucial assistance to the investigation. "I heard about Detective Halsey's condition," Warren explained. "I wanted to see him, if that's possible, to thank him." Quintero studied the man carefully. At 44, Warren bore a physical resemblance to his father that had initially been disturbing to the investigators. But over the course of their interactions, it had become clear that Warren Patterson was nothing like Lyle in character or temperament. He had built a stable life as an elementary school teacher in Nevada, was married with 2 children, and had been horrified to discover his biological father's crimes. "I think he'd appreciate that," Quintero decided. "He's weak, but lucid. Keep it brief." Warren nodded gratefully and entered the room once the nurse had completed her checks. Quintero remained in the doorway, observing their interaction. "Detective Halsey," Warren began, approaching the bed hesitantly. "I'm Warren Patterson. We've never formally met, but I wanted to thank you for your work on my father's cases, for never giving up even when it seemed hopeless." Halsey regarded him with clear eyes. "You helped us find the others," he acknowledged. "That took courage." "It was the least I could do," Warren replied. "I can't undo what he did, but I could at least help bring some closure to the families." "Not your burden to carry," Halsey said firmly. "Remember that. You're not responsible for his actions." Warren nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "I know that intellectually, but emotionally, it's complicated. I've been working with the therapist Dr. Quintero recommended. It helps." "Good," Halsey approved. "Live your life. Be the opposite of him. That's the best response." After a few more minutes of conversation, Warren thanked Halsey again and departed, promising to keep in touch with Quintero regarding the ongoing support group for families affected by the case. A group that, in a unique arrangement, included both victims' families and Patterson's own relatives, united in their desire to process the trauma his actions had caused. Quintero returned to Halsey's bedside, noticing that the brief interaction seemed to have tired him considerably. "I should let you rest," she said, preparing to leave. "Wait," Halsey requested, reaching for her hand again. "There's something I want you to have." He gestured toward a small bag of personal items on the bedside table. "Inside my wallet." The photograph. Quintero opened the wallet to find the worn photograph of Elaine Townsend that Caroline had given Halsey decades earlier, the same one he had passed to Quintero when he retired, and which she had returned to him when the case was solved. It should be with the case files, Halsey explained, part of the record. So whoever studies the case in the future sees her as a person, not just a victim number. I'll make sure of it, Quintero promised, carefully placing the photograph in her pocket. 5 days later, Blake Halsey passed away peacefully in his sleep. His obituary, drafted by his daughter with input from Quintero, detailed a 40-year career in law enforcement and specifically mentioned his unwavering commitment to the Townsend case and his instrumental role in eventually identifying a serial killer who had eluded justice for decades. The funeral, held at a small church on Chicago's north side, drew an unexpected crowd. Beyond Halsey's family and former colleagues, many of the families of Patterson's victims attended, as did Caroline Townsend, Warren Patterson, and representatives from law enforcement agencies across the country. In a particularly moving gesture, each family brought a single flower representing their loved one, creating a collective tribute that acknowledged Halsey's role in bringing resolution to so many. Quintero delivered a eulogy that focused not on Halsey's accomplishments, but on his character, his quiet persistence, his empathy for victims and their families, and his belief that no case was ever truly cold as long as someone remembered and cared about the truth. Blake taught me that detective work isn't just about solving puzzles or catching criminals, she concluded. It's about serving as a voice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. It's about recognizing that behind every case number is a human being whose life mattered and whose death deserves acknowledgement and justice. That lesson has guided our cold case unit and will continue to do so for generations of investigators to come. In the weeks following Halsey's funeral, the institutional response to the Patterson investigation continued to unfold. The FBI formally adopted what had indeed come to be called the Townsend Protocol, a comprehensive approach to cold case investigation that emphasized evidence preservation, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and the integration of traditional detective methods with advancing forensic technology. Universities and police academies developed curricula based on the case, using it to illustrate both the challenges of long-term investigations and the possibilities created by persistence and scientific advancement. Law enforcement agencies nationwide reviewed their evidence storage protocols, ensuring that biological samples from unsolved cases were properly preserved for future testing as technologies continued to evolve. For Marlene Quintero, the conclusion of the Patterson investigation and Halsey's passing marked a transitional moment in her career. She had been offered a position with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, where she could apply her expertise on a national scale. The opportunity was tempting, but after careful consideration, she decided to remain with the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit. "There's still work to be done here," she explained to Chief Reynolds when declining the FBI's offer. "We have over 300 unsolved homicides with preserved biological evidence that could benefit from the techniques we refined during the Patterson investigation. Each of those cases represents a family still waiting for answers." Reynolds, understanding her commitment, approved an expansion of the unit, including additional detectives, dedicated laboratory resources, and a formal partnership with genetic genealogists from the Illinois State Police. The Patterson case had demonstrated the value of such investments, not just in terms of solving cases, but in maintaining public trust in the justice system's commitment to pursuing truth, regardless of how much time had passed. In June 2025, 6 months after the press conference that had formally closed the Patterson investigation, Quintero received an unexpected visitor at her office, Caroline Townsend, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "I've been going through some of Elaine's things," Caroline explained as she took a seat across from Quintero's desk. "After all these years, I'm finally ready to sort through what I've kept." She placed the package on the desk and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a leather-bound journal with a faded maroon cover. This was Elaine's diary. She kept it faithfully from her sophomore year of college until Caroline paused, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Until December 16th, 1979, Quintero completed gently. The day before she was killed, Caroline nodded. I've never read it. I couldn't bring myself to. But I thought perhaps it should be part of the official record, another piece of who she was, beyond just how her life ended. Quintero accepted the journal with appropriate solemnity. We'll preserve it with the case files. It won't be public, just part of the historical record of the investigation. There's one more thing, Caroline continued, reaching into her purse. I had this made for you. She handed Quintero a small velvet box. Inside was a silver pin in the shape of a key, with a small diamond embedded at its head. Engraved on the back were the words, "For those who unlock the truth, E.T. 1979. It's beautiful, Quintero said, genuinely touched by the gesture. Blake received one just like it, Caroline explained. I gave it to him just before he retired. I wanted you to have one too, as a reminder of what you accomplished and what it meant to our family and so many others. After Caroline departed, Quintero sat alone in her office, reflecting on the journey that had begun with the young librarian's murder in 1979 and had expanded into one of the most significant cold case investigations in American history. She carefully pinned the silver key to her lapel, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic, as a reminder of the responsibility she carried. On her desk lay a stack of case files, other unsolved homicides awaiting the same attention and determination that had eventually brought resolution to the Townsend case. Some dated back to the 1960s, others were more recent. Each represented not just a crime to be solved, but a human story interrupted, a family left with questions, a community marked by unresolved trauma. Quintero opened the top file and began to read, searching for the threads that might eventually lead to another truth, long hidden, but not beyond reach. The lessons of the Patterson investigation, patience, persistence, and the power of advancing technology to illuminate what once seemed permanently obscured, would guide this work and all that followed. Outside her window, Chicago continued its ceaseless rhythm, people moving through their lives, most unaware of the quiet efforts being made within the cold case unit to address wounds from the past. But for those who waited for answers, for those who had never forgotten their loved ones and had never abandoned hope for resolution, the work represented something profound and essential, a commitment to the idea that justice, though delayed, would not be denied. In the archives of the Chicago Police Department, the Townsend case files now occupied a special section, meticulously organized and preserved not just as a record of a solved crime, but as a testament to the evolving nature of justice itself. And within those files, carefully placed among the evidence logs, DNA reports, and detectives' notes, was a photograph of a young woman with bright eyes and a hopeful smile. Elaine Townsend, forever 28, remembered not just for how her life ended, but for who she had been and for the decades-long journey toward truth that her story had inspired. Justice had indeed been delayed, but in the end, it had not been denied. And in that resolution lay a promise to all who still waited that no matter how cold a case might become, no matter how many years might pass, the pursuit of truth would continue, evolving with each scientific advancement and each new investigative technique, until all who had been silenced could finally be heard.